It's the Resistance Report, February 6th, 2017. How time flies when you're having fun with Donald Trump. What we're trying to do with the Resistance Report is give you context, connect dots. And one of the most important concepts and understandings I think we all have to have is that the major constraints on Donald Trump right now are not Congress, because obviously Republicans have the House and the Senate, and most of them so far are willing to play along with Donald Trump. With few exceptions, they're not standing up to Trump. So what are the institutions and parts of government that really are constraints on Donald Trump as he moves toward what we might call an authoritarian or totalitarian view of the presidency? Well, one, obviously, is the judiciary, the independent judiciary. That's critically important to constrain Donald Trump. The other is not really a formal branch of government, but in a way an informal branch, and that is an independent press. So we need to be careful about and be very vigilant about what Donald Trump is doing with regard to both the independent judiciary and also the independent press. And we got some hints over the last couple of days, more than we've had before. First of all, as you know, Judge James Robart, a federal district court judge in the state of Washington, on Friday put a stay, a temporary stay on the travel ban from predominantly Muslim countries, 7 of them that Donald Trump imposed. Now, what did Donald Trump do Saturday morning? He did something that no president has ever done. Presidents have disagreed with courts before, and presidents have often said, I disagree for the following reasons with what a court does. That's fine. That doesn't violate the separation of powers. Presidents are completely entitled under the Constitution to disagree and disagree publicly. But here's what Donald Trump did. Saturday morning, he tweeted, the opinion of this so-called judge, which essentially takes law enforcement away from our country, is ridiculous and will be overturned. Now, so-called judge, that demeaning attitude, that almost harassment of the judge, certainly in terms of what Trump is likely to and has already stirred up among a lot of people, has never been done before. This is new in terms of the presidency of the United States. And it is almost needless to say, it's dangerous, because not only does it subject Judge James Robart, incidentally a Bush appointee, appointed by George W. Bush, to the potential for a lot of harassment. I'm sure he's getting a lot of negative, maybe even hate mail, maybe even, for all I know, death threats. But it also conveys a contempt by the president and communicates to a segment of the public a contempt for the independence of the judiciary. In other words, many people don't fully understand that we have a system of government in which there are checks and balances, separation of powers. The judiciary is just as important and legitimate and central as the presidency. But Donald Trump doesn't see it that way, and he's trying to get other people also to share with him. This morning, another example, this morning Donald Trump said about the judge, just cannot believe a judge would put our country in such peril. If something happens, blame him. Now listen to those words. Just can't believe that a judge would put this country into such peril. If something happens, blame him. Now, friends, for a president of the United States to make a public statement, it was a tweet, but that is a public statement. That's what Donald Trump, that's how he communicates with the public. For him to say that is not only contemptuous and dangerous, but it also really does signal a fundamental change in how he wants Americans to view the independent judiciary. And it also imposes a huge burden on Judge Robart. Obviously, in case something happens, it's not the responsibility of anybody, says Trump, except that judge. Look at the pressure on that judge. Consider the pressure on not only that judge, but every member of the judiciary who is watching what Donald Trump is doing to that judge. And ask yourself, is there a possibility that other judges could be frightened, intimidated by Donald Trump's use of public condemnation and rage, and the manipulation of public condemnation and rage at the independent judiciary? Well, it's not just the judiciary, obviously. Donald Trump's campaign against the press, an independent press, took on a new meaning today, a new level of, well, let's almost say sophistication, but that would not be the right word. He was speaking to the U.S. Central Command. These are the military, the high military officers in our Army and Air Force and Marines, and he veered off his prepared remarks, and he began to attack the press for not reporting terrorism. You heard me correctly. He said the media was intentionally covering up reports of terrorist attacks. Quote, "You've seen what happened in Paris and Nice and elsewhere. It's got to the point where it's not even being reported. And in many cases, the very, very dishonest press doesn't want to report it." This is what Trump said to our military leaders. The very, very dishonest press, he said, doesn't want to report on terrorism. They have their reasons, and you understand that. Unquote. They, the press, have their reasons for not reporting, for covering up terrorism, said Trump. And you top military people, you understand what those reasons are. Now, what Trump is doing, obviously, he's creating a conspiracy. He is suggesting to our top military officers, and indirectly to the rest of the public, the rest of America, that there is a conspiracy in the press to cover up terrorism. Why? Why exactly, he doesn't spell out. But he says they have their reasons, and you, the military, you understand that. Now, can you understand, I'm sure you can, how dangerous this kind of incitement is of the public, of the military, suggesting that not only are judges responsible and blameworthy, and so-called judges, he would say, Donald Trump did say, but also over here you have the press who are conspiring against Americans. Kellyanne Conway referred to the so-called Bowling Green massacre in justifying why Trump's ban on predominantly Muslim nations was appropriate. And of course, there was no such thing as a Bowling Green massacre. There hasn't been. She made that up. And by the way, she made it up not just once. It wasn't just a slip of the tongue. She's used that so-called Bowling Green massacre before. And she said at the time, of course, the press doesn't report this. They've covered it up. Well, you see that Trump's statement this morning was a larger version of what Kellyanne Conway said. This administration and its surrogates, the Trump regime, want to create in the public's mind the impression that the public cannot trust the press with regard to terrorism and cannot also trust the judiciary. These are the two institutions that are the most important constraints on the dictatorship of anybody, particularly Donald Trump, as he is merging and moves in that direction. And you see what he is doing. He is trying, and his surrogates are trying to undermine the legitimacy of both the judiciary and also the press. Trump lashed out this morning at a CNN poll showing that most Americans believe that his ban is in fact a Muslim ban. And what did he say? He said any negative polls are fake news. You see the pattern here. What I'm trying to do every day in our little get-togethers is to pull the strands together so you see the pattern. And the pattern here is Donald Trump trying to create the impression in the public's mind that he, only he, is able to understand the truth and the dimensions of the danger we face, and only he is able to do something about it. Anybody who criticizes him, any judge who puts a limit to what he can do, any media that criticize him, polls that show the public doesn't quite have the same view that he does, all of that he considers to be illegitimate. Yesterday on Fox News, in an interview with Bill O'Reilly, Trump once again repeated his claim of widespread voter fraud in the 2016 election. And then when Bill O'Reilly said, well, what basis do you have for that? Now, we're talking about Bill O'Reilly. This is not a sort of mainstream centrist media. Bill O'Reilly. Trump said, well, many people have come out and said I'm right. You know that. That is Trump's evidence for his own assertion. Many people have come out and said I'm right. You know that. Now, tomorrow, there is going to be a hearing in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. A 3-judge panel is going to review Judge Robart's stay and decide whether it is appropriate. But it's also important to understand that today, 10 ranking diplomats, including former Secretaries of State Madeleine Albright and John Kerry, and former Secretary of Defense and CIA Director Leon Panetta, all came out and said there's no national security justification at all for Trump's ban. In fact, if anything, it is going to subject the United States to greater dangers because it creates the impression, more and more impression, in the Muslim world that we are anti-Muslim and plays into the hands of ISIS because of that. Nearly 100 high-tech companies also said that this ban was wrong, it hurts them, that this country stands for more tolerance, greater tolerance, doesn't have a religious and should not have a religious ban. Nearly 280 law professors over the last couple of days have come out and said this is unconstitutional. It violates the First Amendment. But for Donald Trump, none of this is relevant, you see, because it interferes in his view of reality and his view of his own superior ability to know the truth, tell the truth, and react and respond to the truth. He is on the way to, and if he had his way, he would already be becoming a dictator, a totalitarian head of state. This man has no idea what a democracy actually is and how it functions. Now, the good news is we're not going to let him get away with it. And the resistance to him and to what he is trying to do, his demeaning, negative attitude toward the press, the way he talks about judges who disagree with him, this is wrong, and we're not going to let him get away with that kind of behavior. The resistance is growing every day. And hopefully, it won't be that long into the future we have an opportunity to push Congress enough. There is a moment, there is an inflection point where Trump so oversteps the boundaries of decency and democracy that even Republicans in Congress, a majority, are forced to go along with Democrats and vote for a bill of impeachment and then convict him in the Senate. Get him out of there. It's just too dangerous having him in the Oval Office. We'll do it, but believe me, it is going to take some time. It's going to take your efforts. It's going to require your tenacity. You have to keep it up. Keep calling Congress. Keep calling your members of Congress. Keep demanding that this man not have the authority he has. And when it comes to appointments such as Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court, make sure that your members of Congress understand that no Supreme Court justice should be voted on who is a pick of a president who is illegitimate. Donald Trump talks about fake news. He talks about fake polls. Well, he is in many important senses a fake president. There's a cloud of illegitimacy hanging over the Trump presidency, and therefore a critical appointment like a Supreme Court justice should not be voted on. Make your voices heard. Now, I've got some questions that you've asked, and I want to get to your questions right now. I've not seen them. Karen Sharp-Wald, or Wolf. What if Americans protested by not paying our taxes until Trump released his returns? What would be the consequences? Karen, the problem there is a lot of innocent people who want to protest could be fined by the IRS, big time. It also suggests that paying taxes is somehow an obligation we owe Donald Trump. No, we owe it to each other as members of the same society. So I would suggest that we find other ways of protesting. Sofal Peth, is that right? The House has just killed a resolution which required energy companies to disclose gifts from foreign governments. What are the potential implications of this? And is it just a coincidence that Rex Tillerson, has close ties with Russia? Well, Sofal, the reason that the House originally had a rule and passed a rule that energy companies had to disclose gifts from foreign governments was to make sure that energy companies weren't violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and were not being corrupted themselves, and that we were not, as a nation, involved in enabling foreign dictatorships to become even more corrupt and growing oligarchies. Well, the energy companies obviously didn't want that for their own profit motives, for maybe some of them their own personal motives, because many of them have a lot of the CEOs, have a lot of shares of stock, top executives have a lot of shares of stock, and so they have made sure that the House guts that rule. There is no public policy to be served in gutting that rule. There was a public policy to be served in having that rule. And it may be that Rex Tillerson benefits personally. I don't know. I would not put it past him or ExxonMobil or other large energy companies. Kate Loeb, what are your thoughts on the general strike being called for February 17th? Kate, here again, I am in favor of the largest and most visible outpouring of negative statement we can possibly make about Donald Trump, about why we feel that he needs to go. And if it is possible through a general strike to do that on February 17th, that would be great. We've got to be very careful, though. We don't hurt anybody. That is, working class people and poor people who are going to be penalized, maybe, or maybe middle class people because they don't show up for work. Most people don't have vacation days. Most people in this country don't even have sick days. Many people are independent contractors. I just don't want anybody to really be hurt by this. And it's got to be big enough and a big enough statement that it is actually heard. But with those caveats, I'm all in favor. Any other questions? Yes, we have a question from Pam Whalen. Why are Republicans blindly following him that is Trump and his agenda, knowing full well he's crazy and makes no sense. Pam, well, unfortunately, some Republicans, and incidentally, I'm not just tarring Republicans, some Democrats as well, have got to the point where their loyalty to party is greater than their loyalty to nation. But mainly, Republicans are following Trump because Republicans want to be reelected, and they're afraid that if they don't follow Trump, a lot of Trump supporters and others who Trump controls will make it hard for them to be reelected. So we all, you and I and everybody else, we've got to do everything we can to bring Republicans around. It's not just enough to talk to our members of Congress who are Democrats. We've got to bring Republicans around. We've got to make sure that Republican members of Congress understand how we feel and also how dangerous Trump is and what a groundswell this resistance actually is going to be. If it's not already, it will be. And Republican members of Congress may not be able to keep their seats if this groundswell becomes much, much, much greater. That's what our goal is. This is from Andrew Paul. Do you think the Democrats in Congress should block and oppose everything, including forcing the nuclear option for the Supreme Court? Andrew, my initial position on this was that Democrats shouldn't do what Republicans did during the Obama administration. That is, two wrongs don't make a right, and also Democrats believe in a proper functioning government. So my initial position was that Democrats should try to cooperate where cooperation was going to prove to be useful. But to tell you the truth, I've come around. The last 2 weeks have been worse than I ever thought they would be. I knew that they would be bad. They actually are revealing Donald Trump to be more dangerous than I had feared. And so my feeling right now, quite frankly, is Democrats in Congress should oppose everything. Not give him 1 inch. Not give him one nominee, if possible. Thomas Repta, President Trump said that he was repealing financial regulations to help out his friends. Well, I don't think he said that. Did he say that he was repealing them to help out his friends? How was he not immediately reprimanded for open corruption? Well, Thomas, that's a good question. I'll have to look at the record. I think that what Trump said, I believe, is that he was repealing financial regulations because he felt that many people who he knew were doing their jobs and trying to do their jobs and were trying to make the country great again and more competitive, and these financial regulations were doing the opposite, were holding them back. Well, it's basically the same thing you said, except it was draped in kind of Trumpian language. But I think the point is we have enough grounds right now to impeach Donald Trump. I mean, he's been violating Article 1, Section 9, called the Emoluments Clause, since he was installed in the White House. If you look no further than the Trump International Hotel, where foreign dignitaries are now being urged to stay because Donald Trump, they want to curry favor with Donald Trump, and he gets 67% of the profits from the Trump International Hotel. I mean, you don't even, I'm not even suggesting that you don't even have to look beyond Pennsylvania Avenue for examples of unconstitutional actions on Donald Trump's part. So it's not so much do we have enough to go after him as acting unconstitutionally, high crimes and misdemeanors under the impeachment clause. Yes, there is adequate grounds already. But we, as a practical political matter, we've got to get the votes. And we have 2 more. We have now Melanie Speck. What are your thoughts on Nancy Pelosi's town hall, where she basically shut down a millennial's question about how a majority of them feel unfavorably about capitalism? Well, Melanie, I think that Nancy Pelosi's answer, I mean, she may have done it in a way that sounded a little bit imperious to a millennial who was asking the question. But her answer, I thought, was fairly sophisticated. She said that we are all in a capitalist system, and that's true even China, and even the social democracies of Norway and Sweden and Denmark. We are all essentially capitalist. The real question is, what kind of capitalism? And she distinguished between what she called stakeholder capitalism, in which corporations are responsible to their workers and to their communities and to their nations, as well as to their shareholders. And what we've had in the United States since the era of the 1980s, the corporate takeovers, and that is shareholder capitalism, where the entire purpose of a corporation is to maximize shareholder profits. I think that reading from and judging from what she said, and I agree with her on this point, that we ought to go back to stakeholder capitalism. That would be a kind of capitalism that would generate far broader benefits for more people. And we've already done it. We've tried it, and it works. From 1946 to the late 1970s, that's essentially what we had in this country. It wasn't perfect. We were moving toward a better economy and a better society. We were not there yet, but at least we were moving on that road to a wider prosperity, a wider circle of prosperity, more voting rights and civil rights. And then we took a big U-turn with Ronald Reagan. This, I think, is the last question, and it's from Kim Keller. Is there a way to watch these with closed captions? Well, Kim, I think there is. These get uploaded. You're talking about what we're doing right now. Yeah, they get uploaded to YouTube every night, and after which we'll have subtitles. We will have subtitles. But I'm glad you asked, and I hope these are helpful to you. What we're trying to do is just give you, again, connect the dots, give you context, show you the big picture. And so it's not just individual pieces of news, but it's actually, you can see what Trump is doing, what his surrogates are doing, what other of his supporters in Congress are doing. And the pattern is and should be, I think, to anybody who cares about democracy, even if you are a Republican. And I want to emphasize this. It should not be liberal versus conservative, Democrat versus Republican. Anybody who cares about democratic institutions should be deeply concerned about Donald Trump and what he is doing every day to undermine those democratic institutions. I want to thank you all for watching, but more importantly, I want to thank you for your activity, your activism, your continuous and increasing involvement and engagement to make sure that we don't turn into a dictatorship, to preserve our democracy, to preserve what we love about this country. We'll see you tomorrow.